Ferrier was pressured to tell his story by the newspapers, and the Observer on the 18th of November 1905 reported his statement. Quote, "I am a bit surprised to suddenly find myself develop into a sort of hero. You can see I did nothing out of the way. Anyone else in the same position would have done the same thing. No, I did not think of any risk. All I felt was there was a man on the wreck, and that man had to be saved. Someone had to get the man off, and I don't think you need make all this fuss about it."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Unwanted Hero of La Bella.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The La Bella was a 406-ton steel-hulled, three-masted Barquentine, originally built in Norway in 1893. She would come under the ownership of Turnbull and Company of Littleton, New Zealand, and was put to work as a coastal cargo vessel, traveling the waters of New Zealand and Australia. She sailed with 11 crew members under the command of Captain Milius, who had served as her captain for the past 5 years. Her career was not entirely without incident. She was stranded in both 1904 and 1905 at Dog Island, at the entrance of Bluff Harbor, New Zealand, but both times she was recovered without much excitement. There was certainly nothing about her or her career to suggest that she was going to make headlines when she departed from Kaipara, New Zealand on the 5th of October. She made a stop at Burnie, Tasmania, but departed from there on November the 6th, headed for Warrnambool, Victoria, where she and her cargo of timber were expected. The La Bella was behind her expected schedule. She had met with bad weather, and twice they had been blown from the strait and pushed east. Captain Milius would say later that he had been sick as they approached Warrnambool, which had made it difficult for him to find his bearings. The weather had also grown hazy, and the waves were choppy. This combination of circumstances led to them running aground, bow first, on a reef half a mile south of Lady Bay breakwater. All around them, the rough seas pounded the helpless ship with waves, and breakers swept over them. The La Bella had survived multiple groundings previously, but it was clear to everyone on board that it was not likely that such luck would be repeated. Almost as soon as she struck, she heeled over to starboard, and the crew was forced to scramble to the forecastle, the most sheltered place remaining on the ship. Captain Milius made an attempt to reach the emergency rocket to let those on shore know of the danger that they were in, but the rocket was on the stern of the ship, where the ship was exposed to the most violence from the sea. The breakers washing over the ship soon drove Captain Milius back to the bow of the ship, rocket unfired. Those on shore were still quickly alerted to the danger that they were in. Mr. Lindsay, the lighthouse keeper, was attending to the lighthouse meteorological instruments when he saw a light near the reef. At first he believed the light was from a local fishing vessel, and he did not think much more about it, but then he got out binoculars and realized that the light was coming from the La Bella, which was lying on beam ends already, in clear distress. The La Bella's port light, which was still burning brightly, had served in place of a rocket to get Mr. Lindsay's attention. The port had been expecting the La Bella at any moment. She was days overdue, but he had never expected that her arrival would end with her in such a precarious position. Mr. Lindsay immediately sent word to the pilot house and the customs office. That there would need to be a rescue was clear, but that posed some difficulties. Some of the lifeboat crew was out of town at Port MacDonnell, and 2 of their number were in the hospital. The remaining members, under the command of Pilot Rowe, ventured out in the whaleboat, hoping to make a swift rescue only to be beaten back. Through the spray, they could see people clinging to the rigging of the ship, but the breakers were too dangerous for them to approach. The whaleboat returned defeated. The people on La Bella could only watch and wait for help. They were in no position to leave the ship on their own without aid. They used ropes to lash themselves to the railing of the port bow, but they held on to the ends with their hands rather than tying themselves firmly out of concern that the ship would suddenly break apart or slip from the reef and sink. The waves that were pounding the La Bella were causing the ship to bump alarmingly on the reef, and both the people on the ship, as well as the people on the shore, firmly believed that she could come apart at any moment. For 3 of the crew, the exposure and the battering waves eventually became more than they could bear, and they returned to the forecastle around 11 at night for the shelter that it offered. Unfortunately, the shelter was deceptive, and only minutes after they had ventured from the rail, waves swept through the forecastle, and the 3 men were washed from the ship and not seen again. An hour later, 2 of the men who were still held with ropes to the railing passed due to exposure. Captain Milius observed that these 5 were all the older members of his crew. The younger members of his crew were better able to hold on. Even where they were standing, at the more sheltered bow of the ship, there was danger. 2 of the masts had fallen due to the battering waves, and the first mate had his leg broken by the falling debris. He was still holding on, but weakened. They watched helplessly as 2 more attempts were made to reach them from the shore. Pilot Rowe had decided the whaleboat was of no use, and he had the lifeboat brought out and called for a volunteer crew to make up for the missing lifeboat crew. Volunteers were readily found, mostly of the local fishermen, and they put out again. Twice they tried to reach the La Bella, and twice they were forced to turn back to shore, defeated. Pilot Rowe would say at least part of this was due to inexperienced volunteers who could not help keep stroke and kept using their efforts to catch crabs instead of rowing. After switching out some of the men on the boat for a fresh crew of volunteers, Pilot Rowe decided at 3 in the morning to row out again. This time, they were not going to try to reach the vessel, but instead stand by until dawn. In the dark and rough seas, they met with fisherman William Ferrier, and 2 other men who had followed after them to offer assistance in Ferrier's dinghy. Ferrier had been in bed with an injured hand at 10:30 at night when the constable woke him up and told him that there had been a wreck. Ferrier immediately followed the constable to join the boat crew, but by the time he reached the shore, the boat had left him behind. Undeterred, he had gotten in his own dinghy and went to meet the lifeboat. Pilot Rowe welcomed him, and the 2 men who were with him, and had them transfer onto the lifeboat, while he sent 2 of the men who were with him, who were doing particularly poorly, back to shore in Ferrier's dinghy. The reinforcements offered by Ferrier's group was not enough to bring them close to the La Bella. They dropped anchor and waited for daylight. As daylight broke, around 5 in the morning, they saw what appeared to be 8 people still gathered at the bow of the ship, holding on, but they were no better able to reach them as they had been in the darkness. Pilot Rowe thought of the rocket apparatus on the shore as an alternative and turned back to shore once again. He made 2 attempts with the rocket on reaching shore, but both times the line missed, it becoming clear that the ship was too far away for the rocket to be of any use. There was no way to bring the rocket apparatus closer to the ship. The lifeboat was too small for it to be used. They were going to have to go back out in the lifeboat again, even though, if anything, the waves were striking the La Bella with more force than ever before. The hundreds of people on the shore watched as the men remaining on the ship waved their arms frantically to them. Where Pilot Rowe had seen 8 people before, Captain Milius would say only 7 had remained at this point. The pilot had been mistaken. While they had made the attempt with a rocket, 2 more of their number had been lost. The first mate with his broken leg had collapsed, and the youngest member of the crew had laid down next to him in exhaustion. They had both been swept overboard. A sailor named Payne would admit that even though they all encouraged one another and shouted encouragement to the lifeboat, none of them believed that they would escape this ordeal. The La Bella, which up until this point had been bow first on the reef, offering at least a little shelter to the men on board of her, now swung around, and her bow now faced the sea, while the breakers began to strike her broadside. Though she had survived the night, she was now breaking apart and sinking quickly. The new position of the La Bella did offer a greater chance to save the men on board of her. She was now to the edge of the reef where the water was more calm, even though it also meant that they were going to have to work quickly before she entirely disappeared. On shore, Ferrier thought once again of his dinghy. He suggested to Pilot Rowe that he should take the dinghy in tow with the lifeboat and slacken the rope until it reached the wreck so that the survivors could be loaded into the smaller boat and then be pulled back to the lifeboat. It would not have been possible before, but now it seemed to be their only chance of success. The dinghy, being smaller and lighter, would be easier to maneuver in the dangerous conditions than the lifeboat, and Ferrier was skilled at handling his boat, while the inexperienced lifeboat crew was still experiencing some challenges. Ferrier's plans were changed in an instant when he saw two of the members of the crew of the La Bella washed overboard as they approached, one of them being Captain Milius. Ferrier, no longer willing to make a slow and steady approach in the face of two men in the water, rushed to help with no line tied to the lifeboat. Captain Milius would say that he could have started to swim to shore. He was a good swimmer, but he was not willing to abandon the remaining members of his crew still on the wreck. He clung to a piece of plank until he was thrown off it by the waves. Ferrier would pull him to safety, while the other sailor, who had ended up in the water with him, was saved by the lifeboat. Ferrier then delivered Captain Milius to the lifeboat as the rescue work continued. The lifeboat managed to pull another two men who were attempting to swim to shore from the sea to safety, but when they threw a lifeline to Payne, who was still on the ship, it somehow got tangled around his neck and shoulders and he was not able to free himself. Ferrier, realizing that his little dinghy would reach Payne faster than the lifeboat, darted ahead. It was his intention to let his dinghy go once he reached the side of the La Bella. He did not think he would have time to fasten her and save the man. Fortunately, the dinghy got caught by the timber of the sinking ship, which held it in place while Ferrier cut the rope away, and Payne was able to drop into the dinghy. Payne was delivered to the lifeboat as well, and brought to shore, where they were immediately all rushed to the hospital. Captain Milius was reportedly in the worst shape, having been battered and bruised by the waves, as well as having hurt his ankle when he tried to reach the rocket when the ship first wrecked. There were initial rumblings by the papers that the lifeboat crew had not done enough to save lives, but Captain Milius would add fuel to this fire when he stated pointedly that the lifeboat had certainly not taken any risks, and that if they had, his crew might have been saved. Meanwhile, and ignoring his connection to the lifeboat entirely, Ferrier was reported to be a lone hero who had done what the lifeboat had failed to do. The other remaining members of the crew of the La Bella were quick to disagree with Captain Milius' statement with their own statements to the newspaper. They stated that it would have been absolutely impossible for the lifeboat to reach them during the night. The breakers were too much of a danger, and it would have been smashed to pieces. Payne insisted to the newspapers that people on shore simply could not understand how strong the breakers were, only that those who were among them, like the crew of the La Bella and the lifeboat crew, would have known how much danger they really were in. Ferrier also joined in, saying that everything possible was done, and that there was no reason for the hatred directed at the lifeboat crew. In his account, he emphasized their efforts, and the fact that they had worked side by side. Pilot Rowe, meanwhile, told the newspapers that he felt it was the duty of a pilot to show some concern for the safety of his men, and not to take reckless risks. It was an incident that would cause multiple inquiries. The first was into the lifeboat crew and how the rescue had been handled. No fault was found with anything that had been done, considering that the experienced members of the crew were absent, though the public did not seem to agree. In spite of this finding, and there were still rumblings that Ferrier had been the only hero of the La Bella rescue, the second inquiry was into the wreck of the La Bella, and this inquiry did find fault. That Captain Milius had decided to not wait for a pilot and enter the harbor on his own was considered negligent, and matters were made worse when it was found that he had done so before. Though newspapers sympathized somewhat with a captain being behind schedule too much of a rush to do things the right way, it could not be denied that his haste had cost the lives of 7 people. His master's certificate was suspended for 12 months. Life would never be the same for Ferrier. No matter how much he protested that he was not a hero and that the lifeboat crew had worked just as hard, no one would listen. He was showered with praise and rewards from across the country, including telegrams from the Governor-General and the State Governor. He felt it was all too much and he was reluctant to speak to anyone about what had happened, but that could not undo the damage done in his own community. The other men from the lifeboat, meeting with the hostile press and seeing the adoration of Ferrier, turned on Ferrier. He eventually was forced to relocate his family to Geelong, having been completely ostracized by his own community. The work of the lifeboat crew was not forgotten by everyone, however. In 1939, it was reported that Captain Leonard Robertson, ship surveyor of the New Zealand Marine Department, had left his holiday in Rotorua to travel to Auckland, specifically to meet with Dr. Otto Bayer, who was traveling from America. The 2 men had not seen each other for over 3 decades, but Captain Robertson, who had been second mate on the La Bella, had not forgotten that Dr. Bayer had been one of the volunteer crew that had saved his life in the lifeboat. Their greeting was described as very cordial, which was only to be expected. For more information, please see The Examiner from November 17, 1905, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.